Today's book is Bound for Glory by Woody Guthrie. I don't want to spend too much here on the background, but I'll get into the background briefly because I discovered while I was reading this book that a lot of people have no idea who Woody Guthrie is. I was reading this book at work and people were asking me about it, and apparently there's a fair amount of people who don't know who this guy is. Chances are if you've clicked on this video, you probably know who he is, but just bear with me here because, you know, this being the internet, you never know who's watching. So Woody Guthrie was a folk singer who was relatively well known during the 1930s and 1940s. Like, he was a celebrity back in his day. He was on the radio. People knew who he was. He was selling records. He was also very political, so he was like very involved with the Communist Party. He never actually joined the Communist Party, but he wrote for a number of their publications. He kind of attended their meetings. He sang a lot of songs for kind of labor union organizers. He was very involved with unions and labor organizing and kind of the poor folk during the 1930s and 40s. He's most famous for the song, "This Land Is Our Land." You know the one, right? It goes, "This land is your land, this land is my land, from California." But that song, which is one of those things, everybody knows that song. Very few people know it was written by kind of a leftist, communist political agitator. I think my experience is somewhat universal in the sense that a lot of people have this experience where kind of I grew up learning that song at school. In elementary school, we had to sing it for one of the school assemblies, not assembly, like a school concert, you know, one of those things where you practice and then all the parents come and kind of listen. I think we were in first grade or something like that. We all had to learn that song and kind of sing it at the big kind of into school year-end concert. And it wasn't actually until I got to college that you learn, wait a minute. Guy who wrote that was actually a radical communist. And here this is like the kind of all-American song. I think most people are surprised when they learn round about the time they're in college about the history of that song. And then Woody Guthrie kind of went on to achieve kind of new status in the 1960s. So he had a hereditary disease called, what was it called? Huntington's disease, which kind of incapacitated him. He died in like 1967, but kind of from the 1950s and 60s, he was just in the hospital with this disease. But the new generation of folk musicians coming up in the 1960s, Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and Peter, Paul and Mary, and kind of all those guys really loved Woody Guthrie. And so his kind of songs underwent a revival during that period. Bob Dylan was a huge Woody Guthrie fan. He covered a lot of Woody Guthrie music. He's written and talked a lot about how influential Woody Guthrie was on him. Okay, so that's the background. That's Woody Guthrie. I had been interested in Woody Guthrie. I was interested in Woody Guthrie back when I was in college and when I was interested in kind of all this protest music. I never got huge into him. And I knew people who got huge into him. Some of my buddies who were real music buffs or real kind of interested in the history of American pop culture got really into Woody Guthrie. He still to this day has this iconic status if you're at all into the history of protest music. Unfortunately, his music is a little bit difficult to track down. Actually, it's probably easier nowadays with the internet and YouTube and all that stuff. Yeah, I'm sure you can find his music anywhere now. When I was in college in the 1990s, it was hard to find decent recordings of his music, in part, I think, because those recordings that he made during the 1930s sound a little bit scratchy now. And it is just kind of simple music. You know, he didn't like go electric like Dylan did. He's still kind of playing on his guitar, singing into a microphone. I think I did have one album of like, you know, the Essential Woody Guthrie or something like that I dug up somewhere in a music store. So for that reason, I guess, because his music was not recorded in great conditions or is a little bit simpler compared to kind of today's more elaborate pop music. You don't see many people listening to a lot of Woody Guthrie's original recordings, although they're out there. But again, people doing covers of his songs in the 1960s is kind of how he maintained his kind of folk status, folk hero status in the protest music world. Okay, enough background. So, this was sent out to me by a friend and fellow blogger, Whiskey Prager, who had told me years ago that this book would be right up my alley. I never bothered to track it down at the time, but then he mailed it out to me, along with The Intellectuals and the Masses, which I reviewed last year. Then I got distracted by other things, so it took me another year to get around to this one, but I did just finish reading it the past few weeks. So this is Woody Guthrie's autobiography, sort of. Actually, right from the beginning, the very first chapter takes place with Woody Guthrie traveling on a train, like kind of riding the rails, like, you know, the hobos do or whatever. So he's talking about being on like this boxcar with a bunch of other tramps, and he's talking about he's recounting the conversation, kind of so-and-so said this and so-and-so said this and what everybody looked like and where everybody was, and then this big fight breaks out and he kind of gives a blow-by-blow of the fight and kind of all the chaos surrounding it. And you're reading it and you're like, he can't possibly remember it in that vivid detail. Like he's got to be inserting some sort of literary license in here. And yeah, it never says, he never actually says, by the way, I'm inserting literary license. But you figure it out pretty quick. And that's kind of the tone of the whole book, is it's a imaginative recounting of some episodes from his past. And then it starts off with that big fight in the boxcar. And then it flashes back to his childhood, and it kind of recalls a lot of episodes in his childhood. The stuff in his childhood is fairly in detail and fairly chronological. Like there's no kind of big leaps. But then when you get to his adulthood, then it's kind of leaping all over the place. Then he's just skipping several years. He's only kind of talking about it in snippets. It's interesting to compare this with his biography on Wikipedia, because, yeah, you can see all the stuff that he left out or didn't cover. So if you go to his biography on Wikipedia, it talks about, you know, how he got his start, how he got picked up by different radio stations, how he became friends with John Steinbeck, how he was kind of got involved with the Communist Party and kind of got involved with, forget the guy's name, but there was some labor union organizer in jail who was a cause celeb at the time, and Woody Guthrie got involved in that cause. And none of that is in here, which is a shame, because that would be really interesting stuff. Just kind of a more traditional autobiography where he kind of tells his story about how he got his start, how he got involved in stuff, the political stuff. What's in here instead is kind of a very detailed picture of some episodes of his childhood, and then episodes from his adult life, mostly episodes which kind of highlight the rough and tough times he had, like kind of riding on the rails and kind of almost freezing to death riding on a train, and the difficulty of kind of getting food when you're hungry, and kind of being down and out to an extent. This is like George Orwell's Down and Out in London and Paris, where he just talks about the struggles of poverty. This is kind of like Woody Guthrie's version of it. Now, what makes this interesting is, again, comparing to his Wikipedia bio, he was not down and out that whole time. He was a celebrity during the 1930s. He had gotten picked up by radio stations and he was known. It does sound like he had an interesting relationship with his celebrity status, like he kind of pushed against it a little bit and did have some kind of stretches where he was kind of out with the labor folks even though he was a celebrity. It also sounds, again, according to his Wikipedia bio, that his relationship with the Communist Party kind of caused him some trouble, caused him to lose some sponsorships and some deals and stuff like that. But he was not quite as hard up on his luck as this book makes it out to be. But that's not to say that these sections are entirely fictional. Like, maybe he did kind of spend some time riding the rails even after he had made it as a kind of a relatively known name. Although another thing I picked up from Wikipedia is apparently, even once he was a celebrity status, it was very important for him to be perceived as a working man. So he, this was kind of an image he very much wanted to put on. So he talks about, another thing I picked up from Wikipedia is apparently this book had its origins in him writing about his childhood. He had written some, short stories kind of just describing his childhood, incidents from his childhood in very vivid detail. And people were like, oh, you should write like a book about your childhood. Which explains why the bulk of this book is kind of talking about his childhood. Now, again, to compare it with what's on Wikipedia, it doesn't line up entirely. For example, in this book, spoilers, I guess, his sister is killed by a kind of cooking explosion. According to Wikipedia, his sister deliberately set herself on fire after like a big argument with their mother. I guess this must have been one of those crazy arguments. There also was some history of mental illness in his family, which comes through even in this book. So he does appear to be changing things around a little bit. He's also, again, describing stuff in much more vivid detail than he could possibly remember, but that's the artistic license going on here. It's a very interesting portrait of childhood. Did you ever... I think these are going out of fashion a little bit now because we are coming to an age now where everybody has kind of grown up indoors, right? It used to be like in the 1960s or 70s, people were kind of saying, oh, these kids these days growing up in front of the TV, being indoors. It's not like when I was a kid and I was outside all the time. Well, we're now to the point where the parents have now grown up indoors themselves, like generations have grown up indoors. But it used to be the case, a generation or so back, that this was a common complaint that kids these days, they're too safe, they're too coddled. Back in my day, we were out kind of running around in the woods and shooting each other's eyes out with BB guns and riding our bikes without helmets and nobody worried about anything. Right, that used to be a common complaint. Boy, reading this book, kind of, again, assuming he's giving a halfway accurate picture of what childhood was like during that times, the 1910s and the 1920s, these kids were really out of control. So, he describes kind of some of the schoolyard fights they used to get into, and also like there was this clubhouse, and they had rival gangs, and they had this massive fight over this clubhouse, and they were playing war, like it wasn't really, it was kind of really a war, but on the other hand, it was all a big game to them, and they had all these kind of mock sergeants and generals, and were just kind of kids playing war. But you're reading this, and you're like, wow, it is like they're shooting slingshots at each other with rocks, and then they're heating up the rocks on the stove, so they're shooting red hot rocks at each other, and you're like, wow. somebody's going to get their eye out. Or like somebody's going to get this, a rock right in the temple and kind of get a concussion or something like that. And in the book, some of them do kind of get rocks right in the forehead and kind of have blood gushing down into their eyes and stuff like that. But at the end, they're all like, everybody survives, and then they all kind of make up at the end and kind of form one big gang. He might be exaggerating a little bit. He's probably exaggerating a little bit. But yeah, boy, this and a lot of episodes like it present a very interesting view of what kids used to be like when nobody was supervising them. And they were, before they were all on their iPads, when they were all kind of out in trouble, getting into these big kind of gang fights or whatever, or these kind of mock fights. Plenty of other episodes like that, where they're climbing in trees, some of the fist fights they get into. It also presents a picture of an adult world that's out of control, like some of the brutal big fist fights that the adults get into, kind of with Oklahoma politics and stuff like that. And not to mention the very beginning chapter where there's this huge fist fight in the boxcar where he's sitting in, and you're thinking, boy, people were really like violent back then. The way he portrays it, there's this huge big fist fight that essentially gets started right over nothing, just people kind of shooting off their mouths, which leads to like a big fist fight that takes over the whole boxcar. Although he does come back to that at the end of the book and say, being kind of out of work had kind of made these men a little bit crazy and more violent than they normally would have been. The whole book, not the narration parts, but all the dialogue, is written in this kind of rural dialect, where you kind of change all the spelling so that it sounds like trying to imitate how the people actually talked. Some of the slang has gone out of fashion nowadays, but it's an interesting snapshot in time of kind of what the dialect was like during the 1930s, which is kind of what the value of a book like this is. Now, as he gets into his adult years again, it jumps around and it kind of largely sidesteps the more political elements of his life and kind of also, him and his celebrity friends. Although they show up a little bit. Will Greer, who I had to look this up on Wikipedia, but it was an actor celebrity, most famous for playing the grandpa on the Waltons, shows up near the end of the book. He apparently was one of Woody Guthrie's friends in the 30s and 40s. The Cisco Kid, who I looked it up on Wikipedia and it sent me to a comic book character, but then I typed in like Cisco Kid Woody Guthrie, and it's Cisco Houston, who was one of Woody Guthrie's kind of singing partners, shows up a bit in one of the chapters. A common theme throughout the book, kind of in addition to emphasizing how hard Woody Guthrie had it and all the nights he kind of spent sleeping under bridges and on the railways and stuff like that, is him kind of always sticking up for the underdog. So, back when he's a kid, the neighborhood gang won't allow the new kids into the gang, so he leaves the neighborhood gang and joins with the new kids, and he and the new kids fight against the old gang. When describing some of his riding on the rails experience, he talks about like some of the color prejudice, people kind of wanting to pick fights with some of the black people on the train. And Woody Guthrie portrays himself as kind of sticking up for the black people. There's a portrayal right after the outbreak of World War II when a mob wants to kind of break in and ruin the business of some Japanese Americans. And again, Woody Guthrie kind of portrays himself and Cisco Houston as kind of forming a line and helping to stick up for the Japanese Americans. So it's on the one hand, it comes across as a little bit self-serving. You know, he's always he's creating this image of himself as always sticking up for the underdog. On the other hand, yeah, I mean, certainly if you look at his bio, he always was sticking up for the underdog. So, you know, I guess fair enough. And the other thing as well, you read some of these books, some other books that come out during the same period. I think Lovecraft was very racist. The guy who wrote Conan the Barbarian was Robert E. Howard. What was his name? I forget. But, you know, a lot of the other writing coming out during the 30s and 40s was pretty racist at the time. And there's a tendency to say maybe, oh, well, you know, it was the 30s. People were racist back then. So it's good to be reminded that not everybody was racist back then. There were people even back then who were trying to kind of stick up against racial prejudice. It's good to remember that because it takes away any excuses that these other group people might have for being racist at that time. Although while I'm on the subject, again, another thing that didn't jive completely with his Wikipedia bio, according to Wikipedia, at the outbreak of World War II, oh no, actually, I take that back. That does line up. Sorry, what I was going to say is, according to Wikipedia, at the outbreak of World War II, Woody Guthrie was not supporting the war effort because the Soviet Union was in a non-aggression pact with Germany at the time, and the Communist Party was kind of supporting the Soviet Union. And so during that time, according to Wikipedia, Woody Guthrie kind of wrote peace songs about, you know, this is a capitalist war, don't get involved. And then, once Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, then the Communist Party changed its line. I was going to say that's a contradiction, but actually that's not a contradiction because I'm forgetting my history. By the time of Pearl Harbor, the non-aggression pact had been over for a long time. So yeah, that's not a contradiction. Woody Guthrie kind of portrays himself as, on the night of Pearl Harbor, kind of going into a bar and singing patriotic songs about how we're going to beat all the fascists. And that's actually not a contradiction now that I think about it. And yeah, he, according to Wikipedia, he was very famous for singing anti-fascist songs during World War II. And actually, not just Wikipedia, that's kind of one of the first things everybody learns about Woody Guthrie. You know, his famous kind of banner that he had on his guitar, "This machine kills fascists." One of his most famous songs was "All You Fascists Gonna Lose." So that's actually very much in keeping with what everybody knows about him. Yeah, what else to say about this book? It's filled with illustrations like this. I don't know if this is showing up in the camera, which Woody Guthrie himself made. Apparently he was a bit of a sketcher all his life. Again, I was looking this up on Wikipedia. And he had a column for one of the communist newspapers called Woody Says, which apparently he also wrote in a kind of a rural dialect, much like is throughout this book. And apparently he would always put a comic or an illustration in that column. So these are throughout his book. Another thing that occurred to me while I was reading this is how much this reminded me of Bob Dylan's autobiography, Chronicles. Now, Chronicles I read like 15 years ago or something, so I can't actually remember it all that well. But what I do remember is that it was describing conversations in a lot of detail that I thought, or you know, describing scenes in a lot of detail that I thought he can't possibly remember it in this much detail, just like this book. He was not kind of giving a chronological account of kind of his life, and he wasn't even going over what was arguably the most interesting parts of his life, you know, like working on his most famous albums or his most famous kind of political moments, much like this book. And so I thought, you know, I bet Bob Dylan was kind of deliberately imitating this book. Another YouTuber actually kind of pointed out something that I'd forgotten, or must have forgotten years ago, that in Chronicles, Bob Dylan actually explicitly references Bound for Glory by Woody Guthrie, like references reading this book. So yeah, there you go. Probably Dylan's book was influenced by this. Yeah, what else to say about this? There are some very vivid descriptions of kind of riding the rails, the poverty in Oklahoma. This is a book in and of its time, in which this is a book in which kind of the oil and coal and kind of hydroelectric dams and kind of all the steel mills are seen as like the thing that's going to make America stronger and like the friend of the working class that's going to give them jobs. So in other words, this was a book which was written before the environmental movement. And fair enough, because this was a book which was written before the environmental movement. And decades before we knew anything about global warming or carbon emissions or anything like that. So you know, times have changed. But yeah, it is interesting to kind of read this in this day and age when we're so worried about global warming, myself included, and see kind of how during this time, kind of the rapid expansion of industry and kind of the oil industry was kind of seen as something that was going to bring in jobs. Although, yeah, he does talk about some of the trade-offs. So he says when oil was discovered in his hometown, his Boyard hometown, killed all the fish. And, you know, the oil leaked out into the rivers, and you know, what had been a thriving fishing industry, or at least a hobby, was just gone. He said, you know, we had to trade the oil for the fish, or we had to trade the fish for the oil. He said it seemed like a fair trade at the time. Yeah, oh right. Sorry, I almost forgot to say kind of one of the most important things to say about this book is that it's incredibly well written. Surprisingly well written, because you think Woody Guthrie, he's a songwriter, he doesn't know how to write a book. But yeah, there are some very vivid descriptions in here, kind of sucks you into it. Apparently he had a lot of help in the editing process, again according to Wikipedia. But yeah, fascinating descriptions. He's able to describe things with a lot of detail and kind of really make you feel like you were there kind of riding on the rails with him. Yeah, there's probably a million other things about this book I'm not thinking about at the moment, but that's all I can think of at the moment. So I'm going to stop the video here.